too. She had alabaster skin devoid of even the slightest imperfection. Long chestnut red hair that fell well below her perfectly rounded shoulders. And eyes of the deepest emerald green. If not for the eastern cast of her facial features, he might have taken her for one of the temptatious maidens of his own highland home. She was beautiful. Everything a weary, war-bitten adventurer like Kentrell had dreamed of each night in the innocence of his youth, and still did to this very day. A pity she had been dead for several hundred years. Fingering the ancient brute she had almost literally stumbled upon, Kentrell surreptitiously studied his nearby companions. They continued their back-breaking labor in complete ignorance of his find, searching among the crumbled foliage and shrouded ruins for anything of value. So far, the treasure hunt had been an utter failure as far as Kentrell had been concerned. Here they worked, 15 men strong, in the midst of the remains of the most fabled city of all, and the sum total for 3 days of hard effort had been a small sack of rusted, bent, and mostly broken items of dubious value. The intricately detailed brooch represented the greatest find yet, and even it would not pay for them more than a fraction of their arduous journey into this bug-infested necropolis. No one looked his way. Deciding that he had earned at least this one token, Kentrell slipped the artifact into his belt pouch. As leader of the mercenaries, he would have been entitled to an extra share of all treasure anyway, so the scarred commander felt no qualms about what he did.
Kentrell?
Captain bit back his startlement. Turning, he faced the one who had so stealthily approached him. Somehow Gorst could always manage to move in silence when he chose to, despite his ox-like appearance. Running one hand through his hair, Kentrell tried to pretend that he had done nothing wrong. Gorst! I thought you'd be helping our esteemed employer with his tools and calculating devices. What brings you here?
The magic man. He wants to see you, Kentrell.
Gorst had a smile on his round face. Magic fascinated him as it did many small children, and while so far the Vizjerei sorcerer had shown little in the way of spells, the brutish mercenaries seemed to enjoy the incomprehensible and enigmatic devices the objects Quov Tsin had brought with him. Tell him I'll be along in a little bit.
He wants to see you now.
The bronze figure returned, his tone that of one who could not understand why someone would not want to rush over immediately to find out what the Vizjerei desired. Gorst clearly believed that some wondrous spectacle of sorcery had to be imminent, and any delay by his friend in returning to Tsin would only mean prolonging the waiting. Knowing the futility of holding off and realizing suddenly they had a reason to talk to the Vizjerei, Captain Dumont shrugged. Alright, we'll go see the magic man. As he started past Gorst, the giant abruptly asked,
Can I see it, Kentrell?
See what?
What you found?
Kentrell almost denied having found anything, but Gorst knew him better than anyone. With a slight grimace, he carefully withdrew the brooch and held it in his palm so that only the other mercenary could see he had anything at all. Gorst gave him a wide grin.
Pretty.
Listen, Kentrell began, but the massive fighter had already started past him, leaving the captain to feel foolish about his attempt at subterfuge. He never knew completely what Gorst thought, but it seemed that to his friend the matter of the brooch had been satisfied, and now they needed to move on. Gorst's magic man awaited them, obviously a far more interesting subject to the mercenaries' leader companion than any picture of a centuries dead female.
Legend speaks of a long-dead city known as Ureh, thought by many to have been a gateway to the high heavens. It is believed that every 2,000 years, when the stars align and the shadow of Mount Nymyr falls upon the ruins, Ureh is reborn, and all of its lost riches are revealed to those brave enough to seek them out. Now, after a lifetime of research and intense calculation, the Vizjerei sorcerer Quov Tsin has come to witness Ureh's rebirth for himself. But that which awaits Tsin and his higher band of mercenaries is nothing like what they expected. You'll find that the dream of radiant Ureh is, in fact, a twisted nightmare of horror. One that will draw them inexorably into the kingdom of shadow.
They found Tsin, impatiently scurrying about a display of stones, alchemic devices, and other tools of his disreputable trade. Every now and then, the balding sorcerer would scribble notes on a parchment atop a makeshift desk his hired crew had put together early on. He seemed especially interested this day in peering through an eyeglass pointed at the very tip of Nymyr, then consulting a tattered scroll. As they approached, Kitchell heard him chuckle with glee, then resort to the scroll again. The Vizjerei reached for a device that most resembled to the mercenary, a sextant, save that the sorcerer had clearly made some changes in the design. As his bony fingers touched the object, Quov Tsin noticed the pair. Ah, Dumont. About time. And has your latest day labor borne any more fruit than the previous? No. It's just as you said. So far, we found little more than junk. Kindrel chose not to mention the brooch. With his luck, Tsin would have found some relevance in the artifact and therefore confiscated it. No matter, no matter. I let you and your band search mostly to keep out of my way until the final readings could be made. Of course, had you found anything, that would have been a plus. But in the long run, I am not bothered by the lack of success. Perhaps the sorcerer hadn't been, but the mercenaries certainly grumbled. Kentrel had promised his companions much based on the words of the Vizjerei, and the failure would hang more around his neck than even Tsin's. Listen, sorcerer, he muttered. You paid us enough to get this madness underway, but you also made promises of a lot more. Myself, I could go home right now and be happy just to be out of this place, but the others expect much. You said we'd find treasure, and ample amounts of it, in this ancient ruin, but so far we've... Yes, I've explained it all before. It's just not the proper time. Soon, though. Soon. Control looked to Gorse, who shrugged. Turning his gaze back to the slight mage, Captain Dumont snarled. You told me some wild things, Vizjerei, and they keep getting wilder the longer this goes on. Why don't you explain once more to Gorse to me what you got in mind, eh? And make it clear for once. That would be a waste of my time, the diminutive sorcerer grated. Seeing Kentrel's expression darken further, he sighed in exasperation. Very well. But this is the last I will speak of it. You already know the legends of the piousness of those who lived in the city, so I'll not bother with retelling that. I'll go straight to the time of troubles. Will that do? Propping himself up against a large chunk of rubble once forming part of the Great Wall, Kentrel folded his arms, then nodded. Go from there. That's when your story starts getting a little too fantastic for my tastes. The mercenaries a critic. Nonetheless, Quov Tsin paused in his task to begin the tale that Captain Dumont suspected he could hear 100 times and still not completely fathom. It began during a time known to those us versed in the arts of the battle between light and darkness. A time known as the Sin War. Hardened as he become over the years, Kentrel could not help but shudder whenever the short Vizjerei muttered those last two words. Until he last met Sin, he never heard such legends.
Something about the mythic war which his employer spoke filled the mercenary's head with visions of diabolic demons seeking to guide the moral world down the path of corruption, leading all to hell.
The Sin War had not been fought as normal wars, for it had been fought by heaven and hell themselves. True, the archangels and demons stood opposing one another like two armies, but the battles most often took place behind the scenes, behind the eyes of mortals. The supposed war had stretched hundreds of years, for what were years to immortal beings? Kingdoms had risen and fallen. Fiends such as Bartok, the warlord of blood, had come to power, then been defeated, and still the war had pressed on. And early on in this struggle, wondrous Ureh had become a central battleground. All knew of Ureh's greatness in those days. A fount of light, the guiding force of good in those troubled days, which of course meant that it drew the attention not only of the archangels, but of the lords of hell themselves, the primevals. Primevals. Whatever land one had been born in, whether the jungles of Kyrgyzstan or the cooler, rockier realms of the Western Kingdoms, all knew of the primevals, the three brothers who ruled hell. Mephisto, Lord of Hatred, Master of Undead. Beau, Lord of Destruction, Bringer of Chaos. Diablo, perhaps the most feared, the ultimate manifestation of terror, the nightmare of not only children but of veteran warriors who had already seen the horrors themselves. Diablo it had been who had gazed most at bright Ureh from his monstrous domain, who had been most offended by its glorious existence. Order could be brought forth from the chaos created by Beau, and the hatred of Mephisto could be mastered by any man with strength. But to have no fear of fear itself, such a thing Diablo could not believe and would not stand. The lands around Ureh grew darker with each passing year, Captain Dumont. Creatures twisted by evil, or born not of this world, harried those who would journey to and from the city walls. Sinister magics insulated themselves where they could, barely driven back by the sorcerers of the kingdom. And with each defeat by the peoples of Ureh, the Vizjerei added, Diablo grew more determined. He would bring down the wondrous city and make its inhabitants the slaves of hell. All would see no power on the mortal plane could withstand the most foul of the primevals. It came to a point when no one dared travel to the city, and few could escape it. It is said that then the Lord of the Realm, the just and kind Juris Khan, gathered his greatest priests and mages and created that they would do what they had to in order to save their people once and for all. Legend has it that Juris Khan had been granted a vision by an archangel. One who had declared to him the powers above had seen the trials of their most honored followers and had felt moved to grant them the greatest of havens, so long as the humans put it upon themselves to reach it. Quov Tsin had an almost enraptured expression on his wizened face. He offered the people of Ureh the very safety of heaven itself. Gorse grunted, his way of expressing his outright awe at these words. Kentrell held his peace, but he had trouble imagining such an offer. The Archangel had opened the very gates of heaven to the mortals of Ureh, opened to them a place where not even all three primevals combined could have made the slightest incursion. All the people of Ureh had to do was find their way there. Some gesture, the mercenary captain interjected, not without some sarcasm. Here we are, but you can find your own good way to get to us. You asked for the story, Dumont. Do you want it or not? I have far more important things to do than entertain you. Go ahead, sorcerer. I'll try to keep my awe reined in. With a disdainful sniff, Tsin said, the Archangel came twice more in Juris Khan's dreams, each time with some promise, and each time with some clues as how this miracle could come to be. Guided by his visions, Lord Khan urged the sorcerers and priests to effort as none had ever conjectured before. The Archangel had left what hints he could of what needed to be done, but the restrictions by which existed forbade him by granting the mortals any more than that. Still, with the faith of heaven behind them, Ureh dedicated its offers to achieving this wondrous task. They knew what they had been offered, and they knew what fate would likely befall them if they failed. What little we know of that period comes from Gregis Matsi, the only inhabitant of Ureh to be found afterward. One of the circle of mages involved in the casting of the great spell. It is assumed by most scholars that at the last moment he must have faltered in his faith, for when the sorcerers and priests finally opened the way to heaven, how is never said, Gregis Matsi was not taken with the rest. Hardly seems fair. From him, Quov Tsin went on, utterly ignoring Kentrell, we know that a tremendous red light enshrouded Ureh at that point, covering everything up to and including the very walls surrounding it. As Gregis, still heart-stricken at being left behind, watched, a second city seemed to rise above the first, an exact if ethereal twin of Ureh. Before the wide, unblinking eyes of the unfortunate sorcerer, the vast phantasmal display hovered above its mortal shell. Even from where he stood, Gregis Matsi could see torchlight, could even see a few figures standing upon the ghostly battlements. To him, it had been as if the soul of Ureh had left the mortal plane. For when he glanced at the abandoned buildings around him, they already begun to crumble and collapse, as if they had all been sucked from their very substance, leaving only swiftly decaying skeletons. And as the lonely figure looked up once more, he saw the shimmering city grow more insubstantial. The crimson aura flared, growing almost as bright as the sun that had set but moments before. Gregis Matsi had shielded his eyes for just a second. And in that second, The glorious vision of a floating Ureh had faded away. Gregis Matsi was left a broken man. Captain Dumont. He was found by the followers of Rathma, the necromancers of the deep jungle, and they cared for him until his mind had healed enough. He left them then, an obsession growing in his heart. He would join his family and friends yet. Sorcerer traveled all over the world in search of what he needed, for although he had been part of the spellwork that had enabled the people of Ureh to ascend to heaven, he had not known all of it. Get to the point, Tsin. Cretan, with a scowl, the robe figure continued. The point of our being here. 12 years after Ureh, Gregis Matsi returned to the abandoned homeland. He left in his wake scrolls and books, all indications of his studies. He left notes here and there, most of which I have tracked down. 12 years after Ureh, Gregis Matsi came to the ruins and simply vanished. Kensro rubbed his mustache. He had a very real answer for the ancient sorcerer's fate. An animal ate him, or he had an accident. I might have thought the same, my dear captain, if not early on in my efforts, procured this. Quov Tsin reached into a massive pouch where he kept his most valued notes and withdrew an old scroll. He held it out to Kensro, who reluctantly took it. Captain Dumont unrolled it as gently as he could. The parchment was fragile, and the script written on it badly faded, but with effort he could make it out. This was written by a man from Westmarch. Yes. The mercenary captain who journeyed with Gregis Matsi. I find it both ironic and perhaps telling that you approached me when I sent news of my offer of those who might be interested. I see it as fate that we two followed the tracks of my predecessor and this man. This man proved to be Wen Humbart Wessel, a veteran fighter with a thankfully plain manner of writing. Kensro puzzled through the passages at first, finding nothing. Toward the bottom, Tsin offered. Slim mercenary read over that part of the age scroll, which Humbart Wessel had clearly written years after the fact. On the 7th day, near dusk, the passage began. Master Matsi again approached the edge of the ruins. Says I to him that this quest seemed no good and we should go. But he says he's certain this time. The shadow will touch at just the right angle. It has to. Master Matsi promised much gold to us and another offer none there take. However worthy any might think themselves, fly up to heaven, older now, I still wouldn't have taken it. The shadow came like he said, Nymyr's hand reaching out for old Ureh. We watched, certain as before that we'd been on a fool's quest. Ah, what fools we were to believe that. I recall the shadow. I recall the shimmering. How the ruins suddenly looked alive again. How the lights glowed inside. Swear I still will that I heard the voices of folk, but couldn't see any. I'm coming. Those were Master Matsi's last words. But not to us, though. I remember them still. I remember how we thought we saw the glitter of gold that he had told us about again and again. But not one man would enter. Not one man would follow Master Matsi. Master Matsi went in alone. We camped there, hearing the voices, hearing some of them call to us, it seemed. None of us would go, though. Tomorrow, says I to the others. Tomorrow, when Master Matsi comes out and shows all is well, we'll go in and get our fill. One night, it won't matter. And in the morning, all we saw were ruins. No lights, no voices. No, Master Matsi. Lord Hiram, I write this down as I agreed, and it goes to the Zakarum. Captain Nymyr turned the scroll over, looking for more. You'll see nothing. What little left was beyond that passage speaks of other matters, and was of no concern to me. Only this page. A few scribbled lines by an old warrior. This brought us all the way back here? Kintrell felt like tossing the parchment back in Sin's ugly face. Cretin? You see words, but cannot read past them. Don't you trust one of your own? He waved a gnarled hand. Never mind. That was just to show the one point. Gregis Matsi found a way to Ureh of old. The Ureh he had lost 12 years before. And we can do the very same. Kintrell recalled the line about gold. The self-same gold that had lured him into this foolishness in the first place. However, he also recalled how Humbart Wessel and his men had been too frightened to go after it once the opportunity had finally presented itself. I have no desire to go to heaven just yet, sorcerer. The diminutive Sin snorted. Nor have I. Gregis Matsi was welcome to that path, but I seek earthlier rewards. Once they had ascended, the people of Ureh would not need the items they had collected in their mortal lives. Any valuables, books of spells, talismans, those would have been left behind. Then why haven't we found anything? The clues are in the manuscript of Humbart Wessel. For these living mortals to ascend, Juris Khan and his sorcerers had to cast a spell like no other. They had to bridge the gap between this plane and that of heaven. In doing so, they created a place in between, in the form of this shadow Ureh Gregis had found again years later. Captain Dumont tried desperately to follow the mage's reasoning. The gold that he had been promised existed not in these ruins, but rather in the floating vision described by the previous mercenary leader, the ghostly city. He glanced at the rubble, all that remained of physical Ureh. How can we possibly reach such a place, even if it does exist? He said it isn't part of our world, but in between ours and heaven. Yes, finished the Vizjerei. He returned to his devices, peering through one. It took Gregis Matsi, but more than a decade to do it. But because of him, my own calculations took but 3 years. Once I had the proper information, I know exactly when it'll all occur. It's coming back again? Sin's eyes widened. He gave Kintrell an incredulous look. Of course! Have you not been paying attention to anything I have said? But I have told you more than enough now, Captain Dumont, and I really must return to my work. Try not to bother me again unless it's absolutely necessary. Is that understood? Gritting his teeth, Kintrell straightened. You summoned me, Vizjerei? Did I? Oh, yes, of course. That's what I wanted to tell you. It's tomorrow evening. More and more, the slim captain began to wonder if he and Quov Tsin actually spoke the same language. What's tomorrow evening, sorcerer?
Well, we were just speaking of, Cretan. The shadow comes tomorrow evening, an hour before night.
Tsin glanced again at the notes.
Make that an hour and a quarter to be safe.
An hour and a quarter. The captain murmured, dumbstruck.
Exactly so. Run along now.
The bald Vizjerei became enmeshed in his work once more. Watching him, Kentrell realized that the slight figure had already completely forgotten the presence of the two fighters. The only thing that mattered to Quov Tsin, the only thing that existed for him, was lost, legendary Ureh. Kentrell retreated from the vicinity of the wizened mage, thoughts racing. Now he knew that he had indeed followed a madman. All the talk of gold in the past had made the captain assume that Tsin actually meant that the wealth of the city had been secreted in some cache whose whereabouts could be ascertained only by the direction of the shadows at some point of the day. He had never truly understood that the Vizjerei had literally hunted a ghost realm. A place not of this world. I've brought us here to chase phantoms. But what if Tsin were right? What if the legend of the city had any grain of truth? Heaven had no need for gold. Perhaps, as the sorcerer had claimed, it had all been left behind, there for the taking. Yet, Umbar Wessel had been offered the opportunity, and not one man of his had risked the Shadow Kingdom. Kentrell Dumont's hand slipped to his belt pouch, removing from it the elegant brooch he had discovered. For the woman it depicted, he would gladly have journeyed into Ureh. But failing that, some bit of valuable jewelry from her household, or that of another wealthy citizen of the fabled realm, would satisfy him just as much. It was not as if any of the owners would still need them. Zael watched the band of mercenaries from his position atop the crumbling guard tower with much trepidation. The men below moved about the ruins like a small but very determined storm of ants. They went through every crevice, searched under every boulder, and even though they obviously met with meager success, they pushed on. Pale of skin and with a studious expression more suited to a clerk in a shipping house than to a well-trained and well-versed necromancer, Zael had observed the newcomers since their arrival. None of his readings had predicted the coming of these intruders at such a critical juncture. Zael felt this no mere coincidence. Ureh had always been treated most gingerly by the followers of Rathma, who had sensed in it some delicately held balance among the various planes of existence. Zael knew the legends as well as anyone and knew a little of the true history behind them. Ureh had always drawn him much to the displeasure and dismay of his mentors. They believed him enchanted by the notion of the astonishing spells utilized and the power one might wield if one learned how to recreate them. After all, the sorcerers of the ancient land had blurred the lines between life and death far more than any necromancer could have ever dreamed. In fact, if the legend spoke true, then the people of Ureh had bypassed death altogether, which went against everything in the teachings of Rathma. Zael, however, did not desire to relearn the secrets of those mages. Not that he had bothered to tell his teachers that fact. No, the plain-faced necromancer who now watched the mercenaries through almond-shaped eyes of gray desired something entirely different. Zael sought to commune with the archangels themselves and the power behind them.
Like rats hunting for garbage.
Without looking at the speaker, the necromancer replied, I was thinking more of ants.
Rats is what they are, I say. And I should know, for didn't they gnaw off my legs and arms, then borrow from my chest for good measure? This bunch has the same look to them as those beasts did.
We should not be here at this time. We should have stayed away. That would have been common sense. Zael's companion laughed, a hollow sound.
I didn't have enough sense even when I knew better.
You had no choice. Once so touched by Ureh, you had to come back eventually. The hooded necromancer peered beyond the mercenaries, surveying the region from which their apparent captain had just come. There's a sorcerer with them. He's not stepped out into the open since he came here, but I can sense him.
Smells that awful, does he? Wish I still had a nose.
I sense his power. I know he senses mine, although he may not realize the source. Zael slipped back a little more, then rose. The grave robbers would not be able to see them from their much lower vantage points. Neither he nor his paid underlings must interfere.
What do you plan to do?
The black-clad form did not answer. Instead, he reached for a small array of objects previously positioned by his side. Into a pouch he kept handy at his belt went a dagger, carved from ivory, 2 candles, nearly burned down to wax petals, a small vial containing a thick crimson liquid, and the human skull, minus jaw. That had been the centerpiece of the display.
Gently now.
Mocked the skull.
We're quite a height up. I wouldn't want to be repeating that fall again.
Quiet, Humbart. Zael placed the macabre artifact in the pouch, then strung the ladder shut. Finished with his task, he took one last look at the treasure hunters below and pondered their fates. One way or another, they could not be permitted to be here tomorrow evening, for the sakes is theirs, as well as his own.